Every government lies a little bit. Okay, I lied. All governments lie a lot. Western governments lie a buttload. The United States government tells massive lies daily, but at least, most of the time, Western governments try to attempt to spread misinformation that isn't as absurdly stupid and easily debunkable, unlike Putin's and Russia's lies. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, it seems like the Kremlin is vomiting more and more lies every day with a general tendency toward increasing audacity. But it's not like Russia only began lying when the invasion began. The Soviet Union built up a huge reputation for being allergic to the truth. And when they fell, the new Russian government picked the habit right back up, presenting its people and whatever fabrications suited them. But what makes them such keen liars? And what are the biggest lies they've told so far? Once we look into it, we realize that the Russian government lies at a level that few other governments in history can compete with. Heck, they even give the Chinese Communist Party a run for their money in terms of BS. The region that makes up Russia, whether that be the modern Putin state, the Soviet regime, or the monarchical empire that came before, it's always had its government propped up by a complex web of lies. Part of the reason so many governments find this devious means of running the country so easy to come by is that a nation of Russia's size takes a miracle to hold together. People often talk about the USA as being a naturally disjointed country because it came about through violent colonization a few centuries ago. But these same people rarely discuss how Russia was created in much the same way. Before the Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe marched their way violently through Russia, the land was made up of a more diverse range of people, the remnants of whom have mainly been slowly pushed out to distinctly culturally different Central Asia or Eastern Siberia. It is not a state that has come about through a purely natural means, such as geographical factors like hills and rivers. Instead, it was forcefully wrapped into one land with a great deal of force. Now, clearly, invaders can't continue violently massacring everyone who doesn't fall into their idea of a state forever. Over time, that technique of slowly cutting heads off the people that disagree with you eventually takes a backseat to more sophisticated approaches, such as systematic dissemination of misinformation through government propaganda. The Kremlin naturally likes to admit it, but it is still a somewhat regular occurrence for regions in outer regions of Russia to produce autonomous protest and acts of defiance against the government. Chechnya is the most obvious model example of an area that is not otherwise predisposed to being at one with the Russian state. As we saw in Chechnya and now Ukraine, the Russian government will take the violent route when necessary. However, it's always better for the Kremlin's bank account and public image if they can take a less dramatic and more ideas-based approach. The usual method of action is to start with words, and if those fail to alter other people's reality, then turn to violence. This is the exact trajectory that we saw in the build-up to the invasion of Ukraine. In the years before the official launch of the previously named Special Military Operation, Russian media was in overdrive to try and convince people of falsehoods about life in everyday Ukraine. If you are to believe Kremlin-backed stories, then Ukraine was a country overrun by fascists committing genocide on everyone who didn't speak perfect Ukrainian to one another. Supposedly, this chaotic evil state was also soon to be a NATO military base from which the U.S. would launch an evil war to destroy the Russian people through a nuclear apocalypse. As with the most experienced line governments, the Kremlin extrapolated its fabrications from tiny grains of truth, such as local far-right battalions in Ukraine or small amounts of NATO military training. However, once Putin realized that even the dumbest Siberian Igors with literally zero education could see through the ridiculous propaganda facade veiling these smaller concerns, he turned to violence yet again and started ramping up for the war that started in 2022. This combination of lies and violence hasn't just been used against countries, though, but also against individuals. Alexander Navalny is one of the bigger names in recent years to have been the victim of the Kremlin's go-to method of attack. Government propaganda worked insistently to demonize the opposition figure's name, throwing out claims that he was a Western operative and that he had a history of committing fraud. These stories were the first route of attack before violence because it is far easier to give off the veneer of a legitimate government if one is not simultaneously committing violence against its own people. And so the Kremlin pressed on with trying to turn people against Navalny, but all they did was reinforce its own supporters' viewpoints whilst further galvanizing the opposition's viewpoint that the government is untrustworthy and corrupt. Eventually, the Kremlin saw that propaganda wasn't enough to prevent the rallies and protests that Navalny was leading, and so they turned to the trusted backup: violence. However, once things did get messy, it's not like the Kremlin relented on its habit of lying. Instead, it combined the two to produce an often insurmountable flurry of attacks that numerous nations and many individuals have historically fallen to. Once Navalny was poisoned, which we can all agree now was by Russia, the offensive wasn't left to fizzle out by the Kremlin. Instead, they started throwing accusations around at other countries, ending up going with the audacious line that Germany should take responsibility for poisoning the Russian citizen. Outside of the country's borders, such an accusation is obviously ridiculous, but for those who support the Kremlin in Russia, which is a surprisingly large amount, it helps to reinforce their idea that the nation was under attack from the West and that it was best to remain on the offensive on the ideological and potentially military front. The final nail in the coffin for the leader of Russia's opposition came when the courts also joined in with the lies and gave Navalny a 9-year prison sentence for bogus charges. Having such a multifaceted way of dealing with opponents is a very effective way for the Kremlin to discourage others from dissenting. Individuals now know that stepping out of line in the same way can result in career ruining, character assassinations, and potential violence, which will then be supported with further unsubstantiated stories and prosecutions. It is also important for the government in Russia to lie, as the level of kleptocracy makes no sense at all to anyone properly informed about how the country works. Such obscene accumulations of wealth by some of the individuals in the Russian regime can normally only be justified in other countries by monarchy or extremely sophisticated capitalist opportunities, which are often supported by their own forms of propaganda, which are admittedly far less intense. But with Putin and his fellow autocrats, there is simply no way of sustaining their lifestyle without some of the most intense lying known to any government ever. I mean, how are you going to justify the purchase of your multi-million-dollar super yacht with 20 Russian bikini babes for the best interest of the motherland? Unless, of course, you are lying through your teeth. In other countries, chiefs of staff and presidents often have upper-middle-class lifestyles, earning decent wages and sometimes enjoying the luxury of 2 relatively nice homes. Some people in those countries find even that level of wealth a frustrating inequality to deal with. Many people work the same number of hours and live far worse lifestyles and are told by that same government to get on with it and that everything is fair and fine. But if that's frustrating in a prosperous and somewhat free democracy, imagine how infuriating it would be to live in the exaggerated version that Russia has. The everyday person is much worse off, and the politicians are often wealthy beyond belief. Some publications have even described Putin as the world's richest man if his hidden assets are included. However well he may have invested the money that is made as a member of the government staff over the decades, it is completely unfeasible that he has used it in such a way to propel a middle-class salary to the top level of the Forbes rich list, putting him beside Elon Musk. So naturally, the dictator and his cronies have to spout endless BS about how their wealth is owned or why it's not really their assets. Ideally, they would just tell the truth and people would soon vote against them and protest in their millions. But who could resist telling lies if it means they get to keep hold of their royal lifestyle? This fosters a culture of lying from the very beginning. Anyone who enters Russian politics knows that as they progress, bribery and opportunities for corruption become more and more common and increasingly enticing. This naturally means that anyone who makes their way to the top has developed a habit of talking complete garbage and taking bribes. How can any government with this sort of setup be expected to remain truthful? So, when someone in Russia ends up in a powerful position, they've already seen how far lies can take them in their personal lives and see that the same tactics can be used to start unjustified wars and attack opponents of the regime. There is a lying culture that ebbs from the Kremlin's very core. And until now, it seems that much of the Russian population has primarily let them get away with it, if not just falling for the myths completely. However, with the rise of information and communication technology, it seems inevitable that the Russian people will more and more often start to see through their government's lies. Initially, the internet was a tool through which the government could censor opponents and distribute their propaganda more widely than ever before. But as people become more tech-savvy and work out their own routes of communicating uncensored and underserved, they become far more likely to reach their own conclusions and question the veracity of government stories. The rise of Telegram in the country has played a huge factor in the growing questioning of the government since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Initially, much of the Russian population was hugely behind the invasion, thanks to the seemingly all-encompassing lies told by the government. The censorship of certain parts of the internet that provided alternative points of view from Ukraine and the West meant the Russian people often just didn't have any other point of view to turn to. Now that encrypted messaging services have become more widely used, however, it seems that at least some of the population are finally starting to wake up. But it's impossible to predict how long this diversification of viewpoints can carry on. People expected social media to result in the democratization of the Arab world after the Arab Spring in 2012, but today much of that region is still the same as it was beforehand. New technology that helps to circumvent censorship and undermine lies is certainly giving a boost to Putin's opponents in Russia in the short term. But to take this as a guarantee of the crumbling of the Kremlin illusion is optimistic, if not naive. The difficulty of holding the Russian state together and the deeply ingrained corruption in the country means that lies and propaganda have been part of the government's behavior for well over a century. There are signs that it may have to deal with a larger pushback soon, but to tell ourselves that the lying will fully stop in the near future is just another fabrication.